one, and go.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're going to take a brief moment to allow others to dial in while we get started. Okay. So while we're waiting, I would like to start by thanking you all for your tireless contributions to keeping our healthcare sector operational and resilient. I think it's great when we can all take the time to tune into events such as these and walk away with information that helps refine or improve upon already great work that you and your teams perform each day. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get things started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Ethan Muntz. I'm a strategic threat analyst at Health-ISAC, and I'll be introducing today's speaker from SimSpace. It is Mr. Peter Hayes. He has extensive and diverse background in a variety of highly technologically driven fields, including computer network operations and nuclear chemistry. He also works in network forensics, business development, and workforce development. From his Navy service and leading a quick response team of NSA cryptologists and developers who design solutions to some of the agent's most vital problems, to delivering multi-domain cybersecurity training to thousands of students worldwide, or obtaining cybersecurity patents, Pete continues to stretch the edges of technology, its use, and application. Pete's background and experience in CNO and joint operations planning make his experience highly sought after by government and civilian personnel around the globe. So without further ado, here's your speaker, Peter Hayes.
Thanks a bunch, Ethan. That was a really nice introduction. I appreciate it. Like Ethan mentioned, my name is Pete Hay. I'm really excited to share with you all this talk about improving resilience against insider threat. Insider threat is, in many ways, one of the most insidious risks we face inside cybersecurity in general, and for the health industry as well. And as I prepare this talk and present it to you, one of the things I'd really like for you to consider is that what I'm really talking about is an iterative process for risk management reduction through cybersecurity. So cybersecurity as a medium by which organizational risk can be reduced. And so the specific example we're exploring today is insider threats. But this process that we're going to explore can be applied to other risk behaviors of other types of threats, and can be applied there. So I just want to present that concept to you, that thought to put in your heads as I present this. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end. I'd love to hear any questions that come up, even if they're not explicitly applied to insider threat, but instead to risk reduction, like a risk reduction cycle as a process of business. I'd be more than happy to field those types of questions as well. So without any further ado, for real this time, let's talk about insider threats. Let's look at them by the numbers. So as we look at the numbers, $270 million is the direct cost of a single breach of a credit card company based on the $80 million fine and the $190 million class action lawsuit settlement they faced. That does not take into account the legal fees, the actual costs of the investigation and remediation, and then whatever consequences they suffered as an organization, as a corporation, from the public sector at large. 71% of organizations consider insider threat important or very important as in terms of a top cybersecurity threat. And if we actually take a step further and look at the deepfakes and AI-based scams and the phishing attacks for social engineering, those are really forms of insider threat. They're just what I would call an unwitting insider, somebody who got duped, scammed, tricked, confused, or otherwise socially engineered into becoming an insider. In many ways, those insider threats are very sad because they didn't even get anything for it. They just got trouble. We'll talk about 53% of incidents had confirmed data disclosure. And those data disclosures include internal threat actors like miscellaneous errors, privilege, misuse, You notice social engineering. I've put social engineering in 2 different colors. Why? Because is that a external threat? Is it an internal threat? Well, it's kind of both. Lost and stolen assets is another form of insider threat to be concerned. The motivations behind it, none of these are all that shocking to anyone, is that they deal with financial incentives, personal incentives like grudges, espionage figures in, convenience also figures in. Give you an example of financial lapsus is an advanced persistent threat or a threat actor out there that is working very hard to become an APT. And what they've been doing is directly approaching individuals and saying, hey, if you're working at AT&T and you have the ability to do SIM swapping, we can pay you in the neighborhood of $20,000 a week to do SIM swapping. And of course, they say, there's very little risk to you, low risk for you and me. But of course, there's no risk for the person on the other end, and the person doing the SIM swapping is the one who faces the real jail time. That is a difficult proposition to overcome. AT&T is, I know you'll all be shocked to hear this, AT&T stores are not paying $20,000 a week to most of their employees. And so the financial incentives to become an intentional recruited insider is significant. Taking a look at the grudge, what does that look like? We've seen examples of an indignant IT admin who's trying to say, hey, I've made recommendations, nobody listens to them, fine, I'll prove it to you. Well, I think we can argue on the one hand, they very successfully proved it. On the other hand, the 7 years in prison may not have been the outcome they were really looking for. But that would be that grudge-related insider threat. We've seen other examples of here in the state of Florida. There's actually a law on the books that establishes intellectual property as real property, because there have been cases where people getting fired have deleted code bases. Well, that gets to be treated as real property here in the state of Florida. But at the end of the day, unless there are backups, that destruction of property in real property, legally speaking, here in Florida, is that consequences still experienced, even if you catch the person with the grudge. Next, let's talk about espionage. This specific example comes from a spying case. The company Avago in 2009 had people working for them steal information. Avago eventually became Broadcom, and it had to do with the manufacture of semiconductors. And the reason this falls under espionage, because that kind of sounds like corporate espionage, not international espionage. Well, the Chinese government actually backed a company that was started by these 2 individuals, Mr. Zhang and Mr. Peng. When they left from the United States, they took information with them that they used to start a competitive company, and was backed by the Chinese government. So it's both corporate espionage and international espionage, which I think makes this a really fun example for this. And then the last one is convenience. There have been so many examples of these. I'm a veteran, and so there was a case where a database of VA records were lost because of a laptop that was left unsecured in a car, or insufficiently secured in a car, was stolen. One from just recently, a gentleman working in, he worked for a company or an organization that did financial aid. Well, they also had access to 465,000 people's full financial and tax records. He copied that onto 2 thumb drives, went out after work, and for a night of drinking, if you read the article, and when he woke up the next morning after falling asleep in the street, he no longer had these 2 thumb drives containing the records of every single person who lived in Omkasuki, Japan. And then, of course, another example where an employee took employee data home with them, emailed it to his significant other because he wanted to get his spouse's help on some formatting issues. And again, positive control of those documents were lost at that time for convenience sake. So those are some of the circumstances in which insider threat, and even there, we haven't really talked about the idea of social engineering, the unwitting insider, a person who picks up the phone and gets told they need help resetting their password, and that's the help desk attack. We've seen phishing attacks, spear phishing, smishing. Going back to that AT&T example, why do they want to do SIM swapping? Well, commonly to bypass multi-factor authentication. So those are all the sorts of breaches that can happen with both intentional and unintentional insiders. So what does an insider breach look like? Well, taking a look at the, you'll notice from our sources, the alleged Capital One hacker, Ms. Thompson, she used her knowledge from previous employer as a software engineer at Amazon to create a program that identified essentially misconfigured customers of that cloud computing company. Then using Tor to set up operational security, or C, sometimes called command and control, or C2 infrastructure. And the idea was to provide a layer of separation between her identity or her persona and her actions from the actions that were being executed that would be harmful. Then there was a server-side request forgery that took place. So there's a malicious external request. A poisoned HTTP request was forwarded on, and temporary credentials for the Amazon Web Services came back. And then those credentials, those improperly assigned but valid credentials, were used for instant access for the instance. And then they began the actual business of gathering information, finding, reconnaissance, right? Finding the data that they would then try and profit off of, and then finally the exfiltration of those documents that went to GitHub. So that's the anatomy of an insider. And the reason that's important, I want you to hang on to that idea of the behaviors involved, because as we go through the process a little bit later on of what it looks like to build this risk reduction, to go through this risk reduction cycle as it relates to insider threats, what I want you to hold on to is the idea of the behaviors that took place here, like reconnaissance, like exfiltration, like that exploitation of a server-side request forgery, and even the discovery piece, because those are all the risky behaviors or the behaviors associated with that risk that we're going to be kind of triggering on or detecting later on as we go through our risk reduction cycle. Insiders for hire is on the rise. Some of these are subtle, or at least making the slightest of efforts to appear legitimate, encouraging staff to cash in on access they may have to confide data or access codes. And you have other examples that are just straight up, come to us, we'll give you money, and it'll be good. And everyone knows they're doing bad. There's not even the vaguest cloaking of intent there. So how do we address an insider threat? Well, I'm going to put this up because I think if I don't say least privilege and increased experience at some point in a conversation about insider threat, I'll probably lose my certification as a cybersecurity person. Unfortunately, part of the reason we talk about this is, yeah, we do. When we employ least privilege, it reduces the attack surface. It decreases the amount of impact that an insider can have if they were to do it. And same thing, increase experience in our organization. And that means in identifying awareness on our teams to identify insiders. In numerous examples, there were opportunities to stop well-known insiders before they happened. I read not too long ago that there were multiple people who had raised security questions about Edward Snowden before he stole his data from the NSA, and they were in the process of being investigated, but it essentially was too slow, that process. And so increasing experience with, it's kind of the awareness, see something, say something, increasing the defensive experience in how do we respond, what does that look like, who does what when, those will increase the pace and the effectiveness of the response. However, let's go a little bit deeper because I think those answers are just frankly a little bit trite. So we're going to talk in just a moment about cybersecurity mesh architecture. This is a construct that comes from Gartner, and it's an architectural approach to create a collaborative ecosystem of security tools operating beyond the traditional perimeter. What does that mean? That means you may have these logs that will help you contextualize behaviors, but they may not exist in your current defensive ecosystem. That's probably the most simple way I can say it. The idea of this cybersecurity mesh architecture is go beyond the traditional perimeter of your defensive organization, mesh in these additional data sources, and then define the behaviors that quantify risk or threats. and then build the detections that allow you to, again, operate beyond that traditional perimeter. There are lots of characteristics and a lot of very overly technical concepts. But I want to lay out for you what that general idea is, reaching outside of your current defensive ecosystem to access new data that may provide context for risk or threat behaviors. That's how we're going to be focusing in on there. So then we'll use cybersecurity mesh architecture to harden against insider threats. So let's apply that to this specific risk behavior. So first of all, we're going to increase integration between identity management solutions that normally exist outside the defensive perimeter and event monitoring solutions. So like your SIEM or your SOAR platform. We're going to mesh those data sources together. And then we will present that to our in our SIEM to our defensive team, and they'll use that to be able to respond to identify insider threats at an earlier time. We'll build feedback mechanisms, that's what I was just talking about, to dynamically adjust privileges. That's one way we could do that. We can increase the efficiency by simulating attacks against our security stack. What does that mean? Well, we'll talk about the Gartner concept of a digital twin and how it looks to take your defensive ecosystem, twin it out, and then practice within that digital duplicate and introduce a cybersecurity mesh architecture risk reduction cycle. Okay, so let's start with that risk reduction cycle, and we'll weave in all the rest of those concepts as we go. So on your mark, get set, go. First thing we're going to do is identify. This is a generic risk reduction cycle, but we're going to apply this to the specific example of an insider threat. So we go through our risk factors. We pick out the one that we're most concerned with. Today, that happens to be insider threat. And what we're going to do is quantify the risk behaviors, the activities, the behaviors that make up what we think of when we think insider threat. So when I think of an insider threat, we look for the common behaviors amongst all of them. So back to that image we saw before, Ms. Thompson was operating outside of her normal working hours. So this was a personal project, a very personal project. It was outside, not just outside the bounds of her job, but it was outside the bounds of the law. So she tends not to do that during the working day. So that's the first example we're going to go with, working outside of normal working hours. The second thing we're going to talk about is not doing the normal things that a person does at their company, like installing unauthorized software. Next, we're going to say, I'm going to pull this one from Edward Snowden. He not only installed unauthorized software, but he worked from other workstations, encouraged other people to work at his workstation because he had installed keyloggers and was able to secure other people's credentials, to expand his access outside of, and this is the last one, accessing materials outside the usual area of responsibility. So, so these are all, we're just going to pick these 4 behaviors for this one and say, all right, so we now quantified things that are happening. So our next question is, do I have data sources to capture risk behaviors, these quantified risk behaviors internal to my ecosystem right now? And the shocking answer here is we may. Installing unauthorized software, that is not new, right? That's something that we have solutions for inside many defensive ecosystems. So we probably have those data sources. Using alternate workstations, we may have those records, but that may not be something that we're actively detecting on or we're actively visualizing. But the data sources are present. Accessing materials outside area of responsibility, that's a possibility. But you might be looking at maybe Google Drive records, file server records, Office 365 integrations. So maybe I'm going to put that one as an asterisk, but operating outside of normal working hours, that's definitely not part of our current ecosystem. So we're going to say, do we have those data sources? Well, we do have the data source for working hours. That's in an HR database. And we'll say accessing materials outside. Yeah, the records exist, but they may or not be meshed in currently. So in the case where they are meshed in, then we simply design, we start designing. If we don't have those data sources at all, as I mean, not just within our current ecosystem, but if they don't exist, then we're going to loop back and say, you know what, we may not be able to address that behavior or that behavior. But when we do, we're going to start designing detections for those risk indicators. So we're going to say, if a person is, I'm a big fan of heuristics, so we're looking at a logical detection that says something along the lines of, this person is currently researching information that is outside their area of responsibility. Okay, well, you know what? People get assigned research projects, work changes all the time. Okay, so that risk threshold for a single issue is relatively low. But then we're going to say, and they're doing it outside of working hours. Okay, more interesting. But again, lots of excellent employees work outside of their working hours. At least I hope so, because I do regularly. So hopefully that's considered a positive. And so that the two outside their normal areas and outside working hours, again, that may be a special project. Well, now we're talking when you start adding those last two, and there's an unauthorized software installed, and they're working from an alternate workstation. Well, now I may have more questions. Again, does this necessarily mean that that is definitely bad behavior? No. And when it comes to cybersecurity, I have a personal theory that most of what we do in cybersecurity is data science. Because what we're essentially trying to do is take these millions, billions, and depending on your ecosystem, trillions of events, and quantify them into essentially two broad categories. Categories of known behavior and categories, essentially known good, and categories of anomalous behavior. And then we have those maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of anomalous behaviors. And then the data science challenge is to filter those down and say which ones are easily explained, which ones are easily transferred over into the known column. And furthermore, you're going to hear me beating this drum repeatedly, is we want to make sure that that is not a one-time decision being made. I've seen this too often where we essentially get alert fatigue because we know, oh, well, if that alert triggers, I know that it's not really malicious because there are so many of them. We need to have that continuous improvement cycle to say, I've now figured out how to quantify this subset of this detection as not anomalous, as quantified. It's known good behavior. Refine our detection to make sure that we're eliminating those and avoiding alert fatigue long term. Sorry, get off my soapbox now, but I believe that's one of the biggest risks that we face in cybersecurity, is that alert fatigue is essentially the attack against the analyst, where they become accustomed to certain types of rote behaviors. So if the data source is presently meshed into the environment, going back to our source, so using the example of unauthorized software and alternate workstations, yes, it's presently meshed into the environment. Great. So let's design detections, because they probably don't exist already, although for unauthorized software, they may very well. Design a detection for that risk indicator. So what does it mean? How are we going to correlate this user with their workstation? So that may involve actually meshing in information from HR that says where their workstation is. It may be meshing in an asset inventory, asset management solutions, or IAM solutions, and so that may not be present. So if the data source is present in the enterprise but not currently meshed into the enterprise, I'm going to put, and please chuckle along with me, it's all nice and neat in this nice little gray box that I've created here. Oh, just mesh that data source into the digital twin. Oh, that's all this. But we can do this, right? Building a Logstash pipeline for ingest of that data on a regular period, maybe involving Kafka for data normalization or sequencing. It can be done. So, and then design the detections now that we have all of the data we need meshed into our environments. We've reached outside of our current operational ecosystem, grabbed new data, and incorporated it. Now we can build those detections. Well, that isn't good enough. So again, virtuous cycle. I'm a big fan of this. Continuous improvement. You're going to hear that repeatedly from me. So we're going to devise a response action for those positive indications. What does it look like when I say, and it was very similar to what I just walked through, a person's operating outside of working hours? Do we immediately send in the SWAT team to grab them and put them, in a uncomfortable room with a big bright light over their head and someone with a thick accent telling them we have ways of making you talk? No, that's not the approach, right? There has to be a sliding scale of risk factors and at the same time, an urgency of response to avoid that same kind of alert fatigue and overloading our defenders. So devise the response action, and bear in mind that multiple detections and tiering those detections into a proper heuristic is an excellent approach for that. Then we're going to deploy that in a digital twin. Well, what is a digital twin? Gartner defines a digital twin as a duplicate of the environment. And my concern with that is that's a pretty big concept, and that's definitely a big hill to climb. Here, I'm talking about a digital twin of the defensive ecosystem. And that doesn't necessarily have to be every single virtual machine, but it does mean the SIEM solution, the SIEM or SOAR, the EDR, XDR solution, the network detection tools, and the ability to emulate user behavior. Those are the things that I would quantify as critical to the effective creation and use of a digital twin as it relates to that defensive ecosystem. So now what we want to do is take those devised detections and deploy them in the digital twin. And then we're going to emulate those risk behaviors. We're going to have people swiping in and out at unusual times. That's a detection that I didn't mention specifically. How do we determine if they're operating outside of working hours? Well, one thing we may want to do as it comes to operating outside of working hours and using alternate workstations or credentials is if a person's badge has swiped into the building, but that person hasn't logged in, but other people who are not in the building have logged in, that may be an indicator that there's an insider present in the environment. That's yet another detection that we could conceivably deploy. And that would include an interesting, different external data source that we could mesh into our environment using physical security controls, badge management, access management, etc. So now we're going to emulate risk behaviors. And this is, in my opinion, the fun part where you get to put on the bad guy hat, which probably is actually a hoodie and sunglasses with techno music blaring in the background, because it is a scientifically verified fact that we're all better hackers, better bad guys with techno music. So we're going to emulate those risk behaviors, say what are all of the possible activities or combination of activities that could be tied to insider threat. We're going to throw that in the digital twin against our detections. We're going to analyze those results. The other thing that I would point out is this is a great time to test those response actions and the correct environment to do it before that gets deployed to production. Not that anyone here has ever deployed something to production before it's ready and then, kicked off a million alerts. That's certainly not the sort of thing that I would do, but I've read about people who have and learned my lesson from those painful experiences. So then back to that evaluation. Are those behaviors adequately captured? If no, then we're going to loop back. And if yes, we're going to move on and deploy it to the enterprise. So this is an overall vision for how one can implement a cybersecurity mesh architecture risk reduction cycle, and in particular, combat an insider threat risk behavior. As I mentioned before, this type of behavior, this type of cycle, risk reduction cycle, can be employed outside of just an insider threat. This can be employed for other types of attacks. It could be an extremely technical attack, and so you'd have fewer behaviors associated with it. It can be a broader category like insider threat, like we just went across. And the only difference really is the number and specificity of the risk behaviors that one would identify associated with this. So, but the process still applies. And here's the point, and it's the only time you're going to see a slide transition between me, and it's because I want you to see all that is a two-part CI/CD risk management lifecycle where we are quantifying the risks, engineering the detections in the range or the digital twin, and then we're deploying it out into the actual production environment. Okay. So now, how do we practice? Well, first of all, we have to own the fact that essentially an attacker only has to be right once, and defenders like us have to be right all the time. And that just isn't going to happen. We cannot anticipate every vulnerability. What we want to do is build experience on responding quickly to cut down on dwell time, limit impact, and implement solutions to address new threats faster. Essentially, the more times we iterate through a cycle, like we just spoke about, the more times we iterate through that process, the better we become at iterating through this process, and the more experience we develop in responding to whatever type of threat we might be facing, not just insider threats. We want to train our security practitioners practitioners on the one hand and our general employees on indicators around, in this case, insider threat behaviors. But again, so when we talk about general employees, we're talking about awareness. That's kind of an ops problem, right? Awareness training. Don't click on the spear phishing link. Don't become the unwitting insider. When it comes to security practitioners, how do we quickly and rapidly identify anomalous employee human behaviors in our data sources and detections and turn that into a rapid investigation of, are they a dedicated employee and probably shouldn't be sent directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200, or are they someone who is actually exhibiting risky behaviors? We want to conduct tabletop exercises or practical exercises to involve peer stakeholders and executives, identify skill, practice, and technical gaps, and then iterate and improve, which is really at the core of that risk reduction cycle. I want to share 2 quotes with you that were very meaningful in my life. The first one I believe in, back when I was doing a lot of training and technical training, is that there are 3 primary fundamentals of learning, and they are repetition, repetition, and repetition. The more times we can iterate, the more times we can practice, the more experiences we can generate, the more effective our response is. The second one came to me when I was an 8-year-old football player who was, quite frankly, far more enthusiastic than gifted. And what I was told by a coach was, Pete, it's not practice that makes perfect. Practice makes permanent. It is only perfect practice that makes perfect. So slow down and do it properly. And I think that's one of the most important concepts here. And I do believe that is where the key elements involved in this digital twin and this iterative process come in. That it gives us the opportunity to essentially experience our worst day in cyber without it actually being a bad day. To practice as we play, to employ proper defensive practices, to involve, as we mentioned before, involve those stakeholders. Who are we reporting to and when? Is the HISAC getting involved? How are we sharing out information with our external partners? Who amongst leadership is being involved? Are there regulatory requirements for reporting? Do we have legal obligations, etc.? And when we practice those, like we talked about just a moment ago with that tabletop exercise, involving those peer stakeholders and executives, etc., once again, when the fury of a real incident rolls around, we have already practiced that. We know who to talk to, when to talk to them, because we've already practiced perfectly. And so when the real time comes, we're going to have the repetition, the muscle memory, and the ability to deploy out those capabilities perfectly. Since insider threat is all about people, how do we do that? Well, we need to be able to simulate people. So we need legitimate user behavior. Like I mentioned, I think that's one of the critical elements in an effective digital twin is the ability to replicate human behavior inside that environment. Then we need to introduce those simulations of malicious insider behavior. Like I mentioned, hoodie on, sunglasses, probably dim the lights, play some techno, and devise all of those malicious things. Put on your bad guy hat and think about all the devious things you could do. And then last, we want to connect that user behavior with automated attacks to increase sophistication of the threat presence. And again, back to that data science problem of how do we differentiate between the truly malicious behaviors and just the anomalous behaviors of human existence? Because I think there's a quote that I'm sure I've stolen from somewhere that, user is a 4-letter word because all the good ones were already taken. Well, guess what? Humans do anomalous things. And part of the challenge is the number of anomalous occurrences in a network and differentiating what's anomalous with what's truly malicious. Well, guess what? That also requires repetition. So combining anomalous user behavior, as you see there in yellow, with malicious user behavior, as you see there in, orangish, reddish, and determining and helping our analysts improve their processes and repeating those processes to the point where it becomes more second nature to them. That actually brings me to the end of my presentation. I would love to field any questions that anyone might have. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring Ethan back in, and any questions that you've submitted to Bright Talk, I will jump into right now. If you have something burning on your mind at the moment, I'd love to hear that and dive into it. Ethan, did you have any questions you wanted to bring up?
I did. Well, first off, let me say thank you, Pete. Certainly approve of the information and insight you provided today. And taking a look at the queue here, I do have some questions that came in. The first one is, what other sorts of threats or risks can the cybersecurity mesh architecture be used to combat?
It's a great question, and it's a incredibly open-ended question, because the reality is cybersecurity mesh architecture has the ability. We already talked about it in this, that the ability to mesh in an external data source, like let's say something cloud. I think I mentioned the idea of Google Drive access methods, access records, excuse me. And we say, okay, well, now that that data is in here, there are a huge number of behaviors we can look at. Let's say data exfiltration. If we see large volumes of data being transferred out of Google Drive, or maybe one user is doing large numbers of downloads from Google Drive, that might be an example of, it might be an indication of a compromise itself, or data exfiltration. It could also be an indication of an insider. That is the sort of thing that an insider does. It is also the sort of thing that an overly curious employee does. So it gives us more data sources to quantify behaviors more effectively. So I would say there's really no limit in terms of, or maybe the only limit is our own creativity in terms of what we mesh in and then how we might use it.
Awesome, thank you. And looking at the queue, I'm seeing a few more questions. So where does the cyber range figure in with regard to building resilience against threats like insiders?
Sure. So the cyber range is something that we at SimSpace use extensively, and we use it in that digital twin role. So an operating environment that is, one of my coworkers says it really well. He says it's a consequence-free environment. And it gives you the opportunity, like I said, have that bad day at cyber, but it's still not a bad day. I think that's a quote from Wreck-It Ralph, where Zangief says, just because I'm a bad guy doesn't mean I'm a bad guy. Well, you can go in and practice having what it's going to look like for a bad day to happen. And, just because it was a quote unquote cyber bad day doesn't mean you had a bad day in that consequence-free environment.
Awesome. Thank you. And we got another one here. Does SimSpace fall under the cybersecurity mesh architecture category?
I mean, anything can, right? So it's anything outside your normal ecosystem. So what we've done with our cyber range is when somebody wants to set up a digital twin, we have this concept called hardware in the loop. And really all it is the ability to reach outside of the boundaries of the traditional cyber range, out whether by VPN or any kind of data pipelining solution, to bring in logs, records, accesses, cloud solutions, etc., external to our environment. So I would say that's the exact example of meshing. You take a normally isolated sandbox environment, reach outside of it and grab Office 365 logs. Probably a great example of it is CrowdStrike's Falcon, right? It works better when it has internet access, when you can reach back. Well, what does that require? It requires we set up a separate enclave inside Falcon, but you can now use that inside the range, and then from inside a range, which would normally be isolated VM, the VM can reach out and touch Falcon in the cloud, and the alerts are getting pushed to the cloud, and so you're analyzing your tools in the way they're meant to be used. So yeah, operating in a digital twin as though it were the same and grabbing records from the cloud, that's meshed.
Awesome. Well, thank you. What's the best way to test your IT staff against insider threats?
I think the best way to test them is to, I have a theory that essentially the more convenient your life is, the more risky it is. And so the way we want to test that IT staff is by making their life somewhat inconvenient. We want to, the usual answers are things like pen tests, social engineering tests. But I would actually like to flip it over and say, are we effectively testing that and respond, right? it's so common to test the detection, but not as common to detect that full end-to-end incident response component. And what does it look like to isolate a machine, grab a forensic image? How quickly are we looking to restore functionality to that? Are we restoring the exact same machine? Are we swapping that out? Are we preserving it? Are we sandboxing it? Whatever that might be from that incident response. And you specifically said IT, and it's worth pointing out that there's this really blurry line of when something stops being cyber and starts being IT. I maintain that all IT is cyber, or it might be a better way to say that all cyber is IT, because the reality is there's so many IT administrators who have the ability to impact security posture. And that is cyber. And whether we're honest enough to admit that or not is a whole nother question. And I know we don't really talk politics or religion at work, and that's getting close. But the reality is that we want to make sure that IT is getting looped in, because a lot of times they're the people who have to do the restoration piece. And so we might have started our response, but have we included IT in the restoring service, in the, kind of the constant conflict between cyber and IT is IT's focus is uptime, whereas cyber's focus is security, and uptime may not always be their first consideration. And have we tested the connective tissues between those two concepts? And are we effective at ensuring full consideration of the business implications of taking down certain pieces of our infrastructure? And I realize that was like a much more in-depth answer than I think you signed up for with that question.
All right, we got, do you guys recommend TTXs or tabletop exercises?
We recommend all exercises. The more repetition, the better. And yeah, absolutely. Tabletop exercises. I really like when you have a cyber exercise, what we call a cyber defense exercise taking place with a tabletop exercise happening kind of in conjunction with it. It doesn't actually have to happen the same days, but the idea is the same inputs and outputs be going back and forth to make sure that, once again, that connective tissue between the military uses these terms strategic and tactical, and at the tactical or mission element or the individual technical level, that's where that cyber defense exercise. But how is the strategic component of leadership, senior leadership, and as I mentioned before, those external entities like HISAC, how are they included? Well, those connective tissues are commonly the parts that are least stressed and least tested. And the tabletop exercises provide a great opportunity to do that.
Awesome. I think we're down to our last question here on the queue. How often should an organization conduct an LFE for best practices?
Okay, a live fire exercise or LFE. We see, depending on the organizations, my suggestion is live fire exercise can mean anything to anyone. So I get to give my favorite teaching answer, which is depends upon implementation, which is a get out of jail free card question. But the answer is I suggest a very large exercise at least annually. There are a bunch of reasons for that. Many of them have to do with compliance. And then there's also the practical component that's where you want to get all of those different stakeholders involved. As far as live fire exercises that involve smaller units, smaller organizations or portions of organizations, I recommend those on a more like a quarterly cadence, so that I'll use the example of digital forensics. You want to be pushing digital forensics challenge to those analysts on a regular basis. So at the very least, a quarterly challenge for them, in my opinion, would be bare minimum to make sure that their skills are progressing. They're getting continuous feedback in terms of that. Same thing for, like, let's say a cybersecurity incident response team, a CSIRT. Same thing. They need to be tested. They need to practice like they play. They need those opportunities. And the other thing about it is I mentioned alert fatigue, and getting the opportunity to do exercises like that is a phenomenal way to take somebody and pop them out of the rut of the day-to-day, get something new, kind of reinvigorate them, face some challenges, identify the areas. You heard me talk about alert fatigue and kind of rote actions. There's actually this concept called a fixed action pattern, where people get in the habit of, I see this, I do that, and it's just a stimulus response pattern. And less and less of your brain, your forebrain, gets engaged as you create these fixed action patterns. And so there's a very real possibility of not responding appropriately to a stimulus because it looks similar to something else. So these are great ways to help pop us out of our day-to-day, do something new, and challenge our teams. I just saw one more question come in. How do you suggest companies that have never run a live fire exercise to start the process of hosting them? Well, obviously, you can reach out and contact me, and I'd be happy to set you up with that. If you want to do that internally for yourself, there are a bunch of solutions out there. Lots of companies. I mean, you can even just do something as simple as grabbing forensic challenges from VulnHub, or an internal red team. You can set up a small range using ESXi. There are a number of different AWS solutions out there that will help with that. It seems like a prohibitive challenge to overcome, but we really don't want that to become overwhelming. And I think the thing that's worth pointing out is even an imperfect solution is better than none, or an imperfect live fire exercise is better than absolutely none.
All right. Well, with no more questions in the queue, I'll go ahead and give some time back to your day as this concludes the remainder of today's webinar. I would like to thank both Pete for presenting for us today and our attendees for joining us. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and take care.